The rusted blade came to her in the devil's own hour, when the storm outside matched the tempest in her soul. Delphine's fingers had worried at the loose floorboard for weeks, each night working it free grain by grain while her fellow slaves slept fitfully around her. The thunderstorm that lashed Blackwood Plantation this August night provided the perfect cover, its fury drowning out the soft creak of wood as the board finally surrendered to her persistence. What lay beneath made her heart stop. Wrapped in oil-stained cloth, nestled in a cavity carved by careful hands, was 8 inches of pitted steel that seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose. The blade's surface told a story of neglect and rust, but beneath that decay she could see the ghost of sharp edges, hungry for justice. Old Obadiah's final gift, hidden away before his death last winter like a prayer carved in metal. Lightning split the sky beyond the cabin's single window, and in its brief illumination the plantation revealed its true face. The main house squatted like a cancer against the horizon, its white columns streaked with rot and its shutters hanging askew like broken bones. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, swaying in the wind with the rhythm of hanged men. Even the air itself felt corrupted here along the Brazos River, thick with humidity and something darker, the accumulated weight of 20 years' worth of screams absorbed into the very soil. Delphine lifted the blade, feeling how it settled into her palm as if it had been waiting for her touch. The rust flaked away beneath her fingers, leaving orange stains on her dark skin that looked disturbingly like dried blood. She could almost hear Obadiah's voice whispering from beyond, apologizing for his cowardice, begging her to finish what he'd started, but never had the courage to complete. The weight was perfect, not too heavy to conceal, not too light to lack authority. This was a tool shaped with specific intent, forged in stolen moments when Master Cornelius Blackwood wasn't watching the forge, a weapon meant for one purpose only, though Obadiah had died before he could bring himself to use it. Thunder crashed overhead, and with it came the memories that haunted her waking hours. Just 12 hours ago, she'd stood in the dusty courtyard with the other slaves, forced to witness Ephraim's punishment. Poor sweet Ephraim, barely 18 and still fool enough to believe that politeness might earn him scraps of human dignity. The boy had made the mistake of meeting Blackwood's eyes when asking permission to visit his dying mother on the Hartwell plantation 5 miles south. What drives a human being to their ultimate breaking point? Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments, because some stories demand to be told no matter how dark the truth becomes. Blackwood's response had been swift and theatrical. 20 lashes while he quoted scripture about servants obeying their masters, his cultured Virginia accent making every word sound like gospel truth. But it wasn't the whipping itself that had shattered something vital in Delphine's chest. It was the expression on Blackwood's face as he brought down the lash. Pure, undisguised pleasure at the sight of human suffering. This is the natural order, Blackwood had announced to the assembled slaves, his pale eyes glittering with satisfaction. Some are born to command, others to serve. Question that divine arrangement, and you question God himself. The hypocrisy had nearly strangled her where she stood. This from a man who kept his real account books locked away not to hide business dealings, but to conceal the true nature of his transactions. She'd cleaned his study enough times to recognize those coded entries, the ones that reduced human souls to livestock and marked certain pages with symbols that made her stomach churn with recognition. Now, holding the rusted blade, she understood why Obadiah had shaped it. Some evils were too great for prayer, too entrenched for hope of legal remedy. Some cancers required cutting, no matter the cost to the surgeon. The plantation house loomed beyond the slave quarters like a monument to gracious living built on graceless foundations. Paint peeled from its walls like diseased skin, and the very structure seemed to list slightly as if the earth itself rejected its presence. The massive oaks that lined the circular drive had grown twisted over the decades, their branches reaching toward the house with gnarled fingers that spoke of unnatural hunger fed by unnatural means. This was a place where corruption had taken root so deeply that it poisoned everything within miles. The Brazos River ran sluggish and brown past the property line, as if reluctant to flow near such concentrated evil. Even the crops struggled here, cotton plants growing stunted and sickly despite the rich bottomland soil that should have made them flourish. Delphine thought of her daughter Seraphina, sleeping in the next room, her 16-year-old face still holding traces of innocence that wouldn't survive much longer under Blackwood's attention. She'd seen how his eyes lingered on the girl lately, and heard the comments he made to his overseer when he thought no one was listening. The same comments he'd made about others who had vanished into the main house and emerged hollow-eyed and broken. The blade grew warm in her grip, as if responding to her thoughts. She traced its edge with careful fingers, feeling the sharp promise beneath the rust. It would need work to restore it fully, but the hunger for justice that had driven its creation still lived in the metal, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Outside, the storm began to subside, but the restlessness in Delphine's soul only grew stronger. For 20 years she'd swallowed her rage, buried her dignity, made herself smaller each day in the desperate hope that submission might purchase safety. But safety was an illusion here, a lie that Blackwood allowed his slaves to believe only so long as it served his purposes. She wrapped the blade carefully in its stained cloth and returned it to its hiding place, but she could still feel its weight like a splinter lodged in her consciousness. Tomorrow would bring fresh horrors. It always did under Blackwood's rule. But now she possessed something she hadn't owned in decades: choice. The thunder rolled away across the East Texas bottomland, leaving behind a silence pregnant with possibility. In that quiet, Delphine heard something that startled her with its unfamiliarity: the whisper of her own agency, rusty from disuse but still sharp enough to cut when called upon. As she lay back on her thin mattress, staring at the cabin's leaking roof, she began to understand something fundamental about the nature of evil. It flourished not because good people did nothing, but because good people convinced themselves that nothing could be done. Blackwood's power rested not on his wealth or his legal authority, but on his slaves' belief that resistance was impossible. The plantation groaned around her like a living thing in torment, and Delphine finally grasped the truth that Obadiah had tried to leave her. Sometimes the only cure for corruption was to cut it out entirely, regardless of the cost to one's immortal soul. Sleep would not come easily with such thoughts burning in her mind. But for the first time in years, Delphine didn't fear the dawn. Tomorrow, Blackwood would expect the same performance he'd witnessed for 2 decades. The lowered eyes, the whispered, "Yes, master." The careful choreography of survival that required her to disappear a little more each day. But tomorrow, she would be carrying the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath her floorboards, and that knowledge would change everything, even if she never chose to act on it. The weight of iron was nothing compared to the weight of possibility, and as the storm clouds broke apart to reveal slivers of moonlight, Delphine felt something that might have been hope, if hope could wear such a dark and necessary face. 3 days after the storm, Delphine's worst fears began to manifest like prophecy carved in flesh. She was hanging laundry behind the main house when she heard Blackwood's voice drifting through the kitchen window, discussing her daughter with the casual tone he might use to appraise livestock. The words froze her blood. "The Seraphina girl is old enough now for house duties. Have her moved to the quarters near my study by evening." The wet sheet slipped from her numb fingers, falling into the red East Texas dirt that seemed eager to swallow everything pure. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the full meaning struck home. House duties. The quarters near his study. She'd seen what happened to the other girls who'd been granted such privileges. How they'd emerged changed. Hollow-eyed, their spirits broken in ways that never fully healed. Around her, the plantation seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. The August heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, but beneath the oppressive humidity lay something worse: the sense that the very air had become contaminated by decades of accumulated evil. The paint on the main house continued its steady decay, peeling away in long strips that curled and twisted like dead skin. The shutters hung at odd angles, giving the windows the appearance of half-closed eyes, as if the house itself was dying but too stubborn to surrender completely. Even the cotton plants in the nearby fields looked sickly, their bowls small and stunted despite the rich bottomland soil. It was as if Blackwood's corruption had leached into the earth itself, poisoning everything it touched. The ancient oaks that surrounded the property had grown more twisted over the years, their branches reaching toward the house with gnarled fingers that spoke of unnatural hunger, fed by unspeakable means. That afternoon, as Delphine scrubbed the floors of Blackwood's study, she discovered fresh evidence of his depravity. Hidden behind a loose panel in his mahogany desk were ledgers that made her stomach turn. These weren't the account books he showed to visitors. These contained the real records of his business dealings. Names, ages, and prices of human souls reduced to mere commodities. But worse were the coded notations in the margins. symbols that marked certain entries with meanings that made her hands shake as understanding dawned. The symbols told a story of violence that went far beyond the routine brutalities of plantation life. They spoke of appetites that consumed innocence for pleasure, of power exercised not for profit but for the simple joy of causing suffering. Some entries bore dates that stretched back 20 years, suggesting a pattern of predation that had claimed dozens of victims over the decades. As she knelt there on the polished floor, surrounded by the trappings of cultured wealth, Delphine felt something crack inside her chest. The careful walls she'd built around her sanity began to crumble, letting in a flood of rage so pure it took her breath away. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the fundamental question of whether evil should be allowed to flourish simply because it wore a respectable face. The descent into darkness rarely happens all at once. It's a gradual corruption that spreads like poison through everything it touches. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. When does resistance become not just justified but necessary? Your thoughts help illuminate these shadowed corners of history. That evening, as the sun set blood-red over the Brazos River, Delphine watched her daughter gather her few possessions for the move to the main house. Seraphina's young face showed confusion rather than fear. She still believed that proximity to the master's family might offer opportunities for advancement, perhaps even the chance to learn reading and writing. The innocent hope in her daughter's eyes nearly destroyed what remained of Delphine's composure. "Mama, why do you look so frightened?" Seraphina asked, her voice carrying the musical quality that had first caught Blackwood's attention. "Surely this is a blessing. House servants eat better, dress finer. Perhaps I might even—" "Hush, child." The words came out harsher than Delphine intended, sharpened by desperation. "Just be careful. Stay in groups when you can. Never be alone with the master, no matter what excuses he offers." Seraphina's brow furrowed. "But Mama, he's a God-fearing man. He quotes scripture every Sunday, speaks of Christian duty, and the devil himself can quote scripture." Delphine's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes darting toward the main house where lamplight flickered in Blackwood's study windows. "Evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and pitchforks, Seraphina. Sometimes it wears fine clothes and speaks of divine providence while it devours everything innocent in its path." That night, alone in her cabin, Delphine retrieved the rusted blade from its hiding place. The metal felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed her growing desperation and transformed it into something more solid. She began the delicate work of restoration, using a whetstone borrowed from the blacksmith's abandoned forge to scrape away layers of rust and neglect. Each stroke of the stone against steel seemed to whisper secrets, tales of justice deferred and patience exhausted, of moments when the only choice left was between submission and damnation. The blade revealed itself gradually, its true nature emerging from beneath the corruption like truth breaking through carefully constructed lies. Strange things began to happen around the plantation as the blade grew sharper. Tools rusted overnight in the humid air, metal implements that should have lasted decades crumbling to orange powder in a matter of hours. Mirrors cracked without cause, their surfaces spiderwebbing as if unable to reflect the accumulated evil that saturated every corner of the estate. The house itself seemed to groan more frequently, timbers settling with sounds that resembled human sighs of exhaustion. Other slaves whispered of omens and portents. Ephraim, still healing from his brutal punishment, swore he'd seen shadows moving wrong in the twilight hours, figures that walked against the direction of their casting bodies. Old Martha claimed the well water tasted of iron and sorrow, while young Isaiah insisted the cotton plants were withering in patterns that spelled out words in languages he couldn't read. But Delphine knew better than to blame supernatural forces for the plantation's decay. The corruption came from a purely human source, fed by choices made in the full light of day by a man who understood exactly what he was doing. Blackwood's evil wasn't the result of ignorance or circumstance, it was a deliberate cultivation of cruelty, nurtured and refined over decades until it had become an art form. As she worked the blade's edge to razor sharpness, Delphine allowed herself to imagine what justice might look like in a world where the law served only those who could afford it. She pictured Blackwood's shock when he realized that his victims possessed more agency than he'd credited them with, that the power he'd assumed was absolute was actually more fragile than he'd ever imagined. The blade caught moonlight like captured lightning, its restored surface reflecting her face in fractured images that made her look like someone else entirely. Someone harder, more certain, less burdened by the weight of moral complexity. This other Delphine didn't flinch from necessary choices, didn't waste time hoping for rescue that would never come. By dawn, the transformation was complete. The rusted relic had become a thing of deadly beauty, its edge sharp enough to part silk or separate soul from flesh with equal ease. But more importantly, something had changed in Delphine herself. The woman who had retrieved the blade 3 nights ago no longer existed. In her place sat someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something equally monstrous in service. Of a greater good, she wrapped the blade carefully and returned it to its hiding place, but its presence burned in her consciousness like a brand. Today, Seraphina would begin her new duties in the main house. Today, the final phase of Delphine's education would commence, teaching her exactly how far a mother's love could drive her toward damnation. The plantation awakened around her to another day of carefully orchestrated suffering, but for the first time in 20 years, Delphine smiled. The corruption that had spread through every beam and board of Blackwood's empire was about to encounter something it had never faced before. A cancer willing to cut itself out of the diseased flesh, regardless of what healthy tissue might be sacrificed in the process. The weight of iron had become the weight of purpose, and purpose, she was discovering, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The screams came at 3 a.m, piercing the sultry East Texas night like prayers offered to an indifferent god. Delphine bolted upright in her narrow bed, her heart hammering as the sound echoed across the plantation grounds. She knew that voice, young, terrified, familiar. It was coming from the direction of the main house, from the quarters where Seraphina now slept barely 50 yards from Blackwood's private chambers. By the time the screaming stopped, Delphine was already moving. She slipped from her cabin like a ghost, the restored blade pressed against her thigh beneath her rough cotton dress. The plantation lay shrouded in an unnatural stillness, as if even the insects understood that something unholy had just transpired. The ancient oaks seemed to lean inward, their twisted branches creating a canopy of shadows that moved independently of the wind. The main house squatted before her like a malevolent presence, its white columns now gray in the moonlight, streaked with decades of rain stains that resembled tears of blood. Every window was dark except one, Blackwood's study, where a single lamp burned with steady, accusatory light. She could see his silhouette moving behind the curtains, pacing back and forth with the restless energy of a man whose appetites had been freshly satisfied. Delphine pressed herself against the kitchen door, her ear to the wood, listening for any sound that might tell her Seraphina's fate. What she heard instead was Blackwood's voice, speaking in low tones to someone, his overseer most likely, discussing arrangements that made her blood freeze in her veins. The girl understood quickly enough, Blackwood was saying, his cultured Virginia accent making the words sound like a blessing over a meal. A bit of resistance at first, which is always stimulating, but she'll be more compliant tomorrow evening. They always are once they understand their position. What about the mother? The overseer's gravelly voice carried a note of concern. Delphine's been here 20 years. She knows the girl's routine might notice. Let her notice. Blackwood's laughter was soft, reptilian. What can she do? Report me to the authorities? We are the authorities here, Josiah. This is my kingdom, and these people exist at my pleasure. Their children, their bodies, their very souls belong to me by divine right and legal precedent. The words hit Delphine like physical blows, each syllable confirming her worst fears while simultaneously crystallizing her resolve. She'd known this day would come, had seen it approaching like a slow-moving storm for months as Seraphina blossomed into womanhood. But knowing and experiencing were different creatures entirely, and the reality of her daughter's violation burned through her consciousness like acid through flesh. She made her way back to the slave quarters on unsteady legs, her mind reeling with the arithmetic of evil she'd just witnessed. 20 years of submission, of swallowed pride and buried rage, of playing the part of the grateful servant while watching Blackwood destroy everything decent that dared to flourish under his rule. 20 years of telling herself that survival was enough, that endurance was a form of victory. But survival meant nothing if it came at the cost of watching your child's innocence be devoured by a monster who wore the mask of respectability. Back in her cabin, Delphine lit a candle with trembling hands and retrieved the blade from its hiding place. The metal seemed to pulse in the flickering light, its newly sharpened edge gleaming like captured starlight. As she held it, visions began to dance behind her eyes. Not hallucinations born of madness, but memories so vivid they felt like visitations from the realm of spirits. She saw her grandmother, sold away when Delphine was barely 5, whispering stories of resistance and retribution in the quarters of a Louisiana sugar plantation. "Sometimes, child," the old woman had said, "the only way to stop a devil is to become something he fears more than his own damnation." She saw her mother, working to death in the cotton fields before her 40th birthday, collapsing between the rows with her hands still clutching the plants that had consumed her life. Her final words had been a warning. "Don't let them grind you down to nothing, Delphine. Don't let them win." She saw the faces of all the women who had come before her, generations of mothers who had watched their children disappear into the machinery of bondage, their spirits broken and their bodies consumed by appetites they were powerless to resist. Each face carried the same expression, not hatred, but something far more dangerous: understanding. History is written by the survivors. But what happens when survival demands becoming something your former self wouldn't recognize? Subscribe and share your thoughts, because some stories demand witnesses, no matter how uncomfortable the truths they reveal. The blade grew warm in her grip, as if responding to the heat of her rage. Outside, the plantation continued its slow decay, timbers groaning like arthritic bones, shutters banging against the sides of the house with the irregular rhythm of a failing heart. The very foundations seemed to shift and settle, as if the earth itself was preparing to swallow this monument to systematic cruelty. Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh reality of another day in Blackwood's kingdom. Delphine went through the motions of her duties, washing clothes, preparing meals, scrubbing floors, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating angles and timing, planning for a confrontation that would come sooner than later. Every glimpse of Seraphina during the day confirmed her fears. The girl moved differently now, her shoulders hunched with shame, her eyes unable to meet her mother's gaze. That evening, as Delphine cleaned Blackwood's study, she made a discovery that transformed her simmering rage into something far more precise and deadly. Hidden behind a false panel in his desk were not just the coded ledgers she'd found before, but correspondence, letters from other plantation owners describing similar arrangements with their human property. A network of predators sharing techniques and victims, treating the systematic destruction of innocence like a gentleman's hobby. One letter, dated just 3 days prior, made her hands shake with fury. "The Seraphina girl you mentioned has exceeded expectations. Perhaps we might discuss a more permanent arrangement? I have clients in New Orleans who pay premium prices for such specialized merchandise." The word swam before her eyes as the full scope of Blackwood's intentions became clear. This wasn't just about his personal appetites, it was about profit, about reducing her daughter to a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder in markets that traded exclusively in human suffering. Seraphina wasn't just being violated. She was being prepared for sale to men whose depravities made Blackwood look merciful by comparison. Something snapped inside Delphine's chest, a sound like breaking glass in the chambers of her heart. The woman who had entered the study that evening ceased to exist, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. She was no longer a mother trying to protect her child. She was an instrument of judgment, shaped by decades of injustice and honed to a razor's edge by the touch of absolute necessity. She memorized every detail of the letters, every name and date and coded reference, building a case that would never see the inside of a courtroom but would be adjudicated by a higher authority than human law. As she worked, the mirrors in the room began to crack without cause, their surfaces spiderwebbing as if they couldn't bear to reflect what was happening behind them. The plantation house seemed to sense the change in her, its groaning timbers taking on a new quality, less like the sounds of decay and more like whispers of encouragement from the ghosts of all who had suffered within these walls. The shadows in the corners grew deeper, darker, more substantial, as if the accumulated spirits of Blackwood's victims were gathering to witness what was about to unfold. By the time Delphine finished her work and returned to the slave quarters, she was no longer the same person who had awakened to her daughter's screams just 24 hours earlier. The blade waited for her beneath the floorboards, its presence no longer a comfort but a promise. Tomorrow she would begin the final phase of her preparation, sharpening not just the steel but her own resolve until both were capable of cutting through the carefully constructed lies that allowed evil to flourish in broad daylight. The devil's arithmetic was simple. Some evils were too great to be endured. some prices too high to be paid, and sometimes the only equation that balanced was the one written in blood and settled with interest, compounded over 20 years of careful patience. The weight of iron had become the weight of inevitability, and Delphine finally understood why the blade had waited so long for her touch. It hadn't been shaped for Obadiah's hands. It had been forged for this moment, for this purpose, for a reckoning that would echo through the halls of Blackwood's empire like thunder from a clear sky. The corruption had spread far enough. Tomorrow she will begin cutting it out. The storm that broke over Blackwood Plantation on the 7th night came not from the Gulf of Mexico, but from the accumulated rage of 20 years' worth of swallowed screams. Delphine had been waiting in the shadows of the kitchen garden when the first rumble of thunder rolled across the Brazos River bottomland. The August air hung thick and oppressive, charged with electricity that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Lightning flickered on the horizon like the winking eyes of vengeful spirits, and she knew with absolute certainty that tonight would mark the end of everything, one way or another. The rusted blade lay concealed beneath her rough cotton dress, its weight no longer foreign against her thigh but familiar as her own pulse. 3 days of careful preparation had brought her to this moment, studying Blackwood's routines, memorizing the layout of the main house, calculating the precise choreography of justice that would unfold once she stepped through that door. But first, she needed to be certain of her daughter's location. Through the kitchen window, she could see into the main house's central hallway, where lamplight cast dancing shadows on walls lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, generations of Virginia gentility built on the bones of human chattel. The house itself seemed to crouch beneath the approaching storm, its white columns now gray with age and neglect, its foundation settling with sounds that resembled the groans of buried souls clawing their way toward daylight. A flash of lightning illuminated Seraphina's slight form moving through the hallway, carrying a tea service toward Blackwood's study. The girl's movements were different now, careful, hesitant, the natural grace of youth replaced by the calculated steps of prey that had learned to fear its predator. Even from this distance, Delphine could see how her daughter's shoulders hunched with shame, how her eyes remained fixed on the floor in a desperate attempt to make herself invisible. The sight sent a fresh wave of fury through Delphine's chest, white-hot and purifying as molten steel. This was what Blackwood's Christian civilization produced. Children who walked like ghosts through their own lives, carrying the weight of violations that would poison their dreams for decades to come. This was the fruit of a system that reduced human souls to livestock and called it God's will. Thunder crashed overhead, as if the heavens themselves were protesting the abominations that had taken place beneath this roof. The storm windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere in the house a shutter came loose, banging against the exterior wall with the irregular rhythm of a dying heart. The plantation's ancient oaks bent almost horizontal under the wind's assault, their twisted branches clawing at the air like the hands of drowning men. Delphine waited until Seraphina had delivered the tea and retreated to the servants' quarters before making her move. She slipped through the kitchen door with the silence of accumulated practice, her bare feet finding the familiar path through rooms she'd cleaned for 2 decades. Every creak of floorboard, every groan of timber was known to her, catalogued and memorized during years of invisible servitude. The main hallway stretched before her like a throat, lined with the portraits of dead masters, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with expressions of aristocratic disapproval. Lightning strobed through the tall windows, casting her shadow in multiple directions simultaneously, as if even her reflection understood that she was no longer one woman but many, the culmination of generations who had endured what could not be endured, who had swallowed injustice until it transformed into something far more dangerous. Blackwood's study door stood slightly ajar, spilling warm lamplight into the corridor. Through the gap, she could see him seated behind his mahogany desk, a brandy snifter in one hand and a ledger open before him. He was humming softly to himself, a hymn she realized with sickening irony, something about being washed clean in the blood of the Lamb. His face wore an expression of sublime contentment, the look of a man whose appetites had been thoroughly satisfied. Another crash of thunder, and this time the house's lights flickered, oil lamps guttering in their chimneys as if the very air had become too poisoned to sustain flame. In that moment of near darkness, Delphine saw her reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back had eyes like chips of flint. A mouth set in a line that spoke of judgments rendered and sentences prepared for execution. She pushed the study door open and stepped inside. Blackwood looked up from his ledger with mild annoyance, clearly expecting to see one of his house servants bringing him something he'd requested. When he saw Delphine instead, his pale eyebrows drew together in confusion. "What are you doing here?" His cultured Virginia accent carried more irritation than concern. "You know the rules about entering the main house after—" "I know the rules," Delphine said quietly, closing the door behind her. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. "I've lived by your rules for 20 years, Master Blackwood. 20 years of yes, sir, no, sir, whatever pleases you, sir." Something in her tone made him lean back in his chair, his hand instinctively reaching for the bell pull that would summon his overseer. But Delphine was already moving, crossing the room with fluid grace to position herself between him and the door. The blade remained hidden beneath her dress, but its presence seemed to charge the air around her with potential energy. "You seem agitated, Delphine." Blackwood's voice carried a note of caution now, though he still maintained the patronizing tone he used with all his human property. "Perhaps you should return to your quarters and we can discuss whatever's troubling you in the morning, when you've had time to—" "Time to what?" The question came out sharp as broken glass. "Time to accept what you've done to my daughter? Time to swallow my rage like I've swallowed everything else for 20 years? Lightning flashed outside the tall windows, illuminating the study in stark black and white. In that instant, Blackwood seemed to see something in her face that made him stiffen with alarm. His hand moved more urgently toward the bell pull, but stopped when Delphine took another step closer to his desk. "Now see here," he began, falling back on the authority that had served him his entire life. "I don't know what wild notions you've gotten into your head, but—" "Wild notions?" Delphine laughed, and the sound held no humor whatsoever. "You mean like the wild notion that my daughter is a human being rather than livestock? That she has a right to her own body, her own innocence? When words fail and law offers no protection, what remains but the terrible arithmetic of personal justice? Subscribe and share your thoughts on where civilization ends and survival begins, because some confrontations demand witnesses." Blackwood's face flushed red with indignation. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner? I am your master, ordained by God and sanctioned by law to what?" Delphine's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "To destroy children for your entertainment? To trade in human flesh like it was cotton or tobacco? I've seen your real ledgers, Cornelius. I've read your correspondence with those other devils who share your appetites." The use of his Christian name hit him like a physical blow. For 20 years she had never spoken it aloud, never claimed the basic human right to address him as an equal. The intimacy of it in this context was more shocking than any curse could have been. "You forget yourself," he snarled, rising from his chair with the authority of centuries of unquestioned privilege. "You are nothing but property, a piece of livestock that I can dispose of as I see fit. Your daughter, your body, your very life belong to me by divine right and—" "Divine right?" Delphine pulled the blade from beneath her dress in one smooth motion, its newly sharpened edge catching the lamplight like captured lightning. "Tell me about divine rights when you're explaining to your maker why you chose to become a monster." Blackwood's eyes widened as he stared at the weapon, his face going pale beneath his Virginia gentleman's tan. For the first time in his life, he found himself face to face with a piece of his property that was no longer willing to submit, no longer willing to pretend that his authority extended beyond the reach of steel and righteous fury. "You wouldn't dare," he breathed, but his voice carried no conviction. "You know what would happen to you, to your daughter, if you—" "My daughter is already lost," Delphine said with terrible certainty. "You've seen to that. But perhaps I can prevent you from destroying any others." Thunder crashed directly overhead, so close and violent that the windows rattled in their frames and the oil lamps flickered dangerously. In the brief darkness that followed, the study seemed to fill with shadows that moved independently of their sources, the accumulated spirits of all who had suffered within these walls, gathering to witness the moment when the victim finally became victor. Blackwood backed toward the fireplace, his hands groping for anything that might serve as a weapon. But 20 years of soft living had left him unprepared for physical confrontation, while 20 years of brutal oppression had honed Delphine into something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible. "Please," he whispered, and the word tasted strange on lips that had never before been required to beg. "I can—" We can make arrangements. Money, perhaps, or your daughter's freedom, or freedom. Delphine's laugh was like breaking glass. You think freedom is something you can grant or withhold? You think justice is a commodity you can purchase with blood money? She advanced another step, and the blade in her hand seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, rain lashing against the windows like the tears of every soul who had ever suffered under this roof. The house groaned around them, timbers settling with sounds that resembled the collective sighs of the dead demanding satisfaction. You made your choice 20 years ago, Delphine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You chose to become something inhuman, something that feeds on suffering and calls it civilization. Now I'm making mine. The confrontation had reached its inevitable conclusion, 2 decades of accumulated injustice crystallizing into a moment that would echo through eternity. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the portraits of dead masters and the ghosts of murdered innocents, predator and prey faced each other across a chasm that could only be bridged with blood. The storm raged on, and in its fury, the very foundations of Blackwood's empire began to crack. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, 20 years of accumulated injustice crystallizing into a single point of inevitable consequence. Blackwood pressed himself against the fireplace mantel, his pale hands scrabbling for purchase on the cold marble, as if he could somehow merge with the stone and escape the judgment that advanced toward him with measured steps. His face had gone the color of old parchment, sweat beading on his forehead despite the storm's cooling influence. For the first time in his 53 years of privileged existence, Cornelius Blackwood found himself face to face with a truth he had spent decades denying. Evil, no matter how well-dressed or legally sanctioned, eventually called forth its own destruction. You think you understand justice, Delphine said, her voice carrying a terrible calm that made the thunder outside seem gentle by comparison. But justice isn't something that comes from courthouses or statute books. Justice is what happens when the accumulated weight of suffering becomes too great for the universe to bear. The blade in her hand caught the lamplight, its restored surface reflecting not just the flames but something deeper. The gathered fury of every soul who had ever been reduced to property, every child who had been sold away from their mother's arms, every woman who had been forced to smile while monsters devoured their humanity, piece by piece. Please, Blackwood whispered again, the word foreign on his tongue. I can make amends. I can free your daughter, give you papers, send you both north where... North? Delphine's laugh held no warmth. To what? To spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for bounty hunters? To watch my daughter flinch every time a white man speaks to her? You think geography can heal what you've done? Lightning illuminated the study in stark clarity, revealing the true nature of what surrounded them. The portraits of Blackwood ancestors seemed to sneer down from their gilded frames, their painted eyes reflecting the moral bankruptcy that had been passed down like a family heirloom from generation to generation. The leather-bound books that lined the shelves, volumes of philosophy and theology that Blackwood quoted to justify his atrocities, appeared to shrink back from the confrontation, as if even ideas could recognize the moment when intellectual hypocrisy finally met its reckoning. You made me into this, Delphine continued, taking another step forward. The blade remained steady in her grip, its point aimed at the heart of a man who had demonstrated repeatedly that he possessed no such organ. 20 years of watching you destroy everything decent that tried to flourish under your rule. 20 years of swallowing my rage until it fermented into something strong enough to burn through the lies that prop up your entire world. Blackwood's hand found the brass fire poker beside the hearth, his fingers closing around it with desperate hope. But even as he raised the improvised weapon, they both understood how inadequate it was against what approached him. This wasn't a contest of physical strength. It was a moral reckoning 20 years in the making, and no amount of Virginia gentleman's privilege could deflect what was coming. I gave you shelter, he protested, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. Food, clothing, protection. I could have sold you a dozen times over, but I kept you here. Kept your family together. Kept us. The word came out like poison. Like you kept your hunting dogs? Like you kept your prize bull for breeding? You speak of shelter while you built our prison, of protection while you were the greatest threat we faced. The storm reached its crescendo, rain lashing against the windows with such violence that the glass bowed inward, threatening to shatter. The wind howled through the eaves of the old house, creating a symphony of destruction that seemed to celebrate the approaching end of Blackwood's reign of terror. Even the oil lamps flickered more dramatically now, their flames dancing like spirits eager to witness justice finally being served. "God will judge you for this," Blackwood said, raising the poker with trembling hands. "Murder is a sin, no matter what justifications you—" "God?" Delphine's eyes blazed with unholy fire. "The same God you invoke every Sunday while you count your human cattle? The God whose name you whisper while you destroy innocents for your entertainment?" She gestured toward his desk with the blade. "I've seen your real scripture, Cornelius. Those ledgers are your true Bible, and they preach a gospel of damnation that you authored yourself." The confrontation had moved beyond words now, entering that realm where actions carried the weight of absolute necessity. Blackwood lunged forward with the poker, his movement clumsy with panic and soft living. But Delphine had been preparing for this moment longer than he could imagine, her body and mind honed by years of anticipating violence, of calculating survival in a world where death could come at any master's whim. The blade moved with surgical precision, finding the gap between Blackwood's ribs as if guided by the accumulated wisdom of every enslaved person who had ever dreamed of such a moment. There was no drama in it, no theatrical flourish, just the clean, inevitable consequence of choices made long ago in the full light of moral understanding. Blackwood's eyes went wide with shock, not at the pain, but at the reality of his own mortality suddenly made manifest. The poker clattered to the floor as his hands moved to the wound, fingers coming away red with the proof of his humanity. For all his pretensions to divine authority, he bled the same color as those he had brutalized. "This isn't possible," he gasped, stumbling backward against his desk. I was chosen by God to rule over—" "You chose," Delphine corrected, her voice steady as stone. "You chose to become a monster, and monsters always meet the same end. The only difference is how long they're allowed to feed before someone finds the courage to stop them." The light was fading from Blackwood's eyes, but his mouth continued to move, forming words that held no more authority than the winter wind. He spoke of laws and property rights, of divine mandate and natural order, clinging to the intellectual scaffolding that had supported his atrocities even as life leaked from his body onto the imported Persian carpet. Delphine watched without emotion as the man who had shaped her existence through fear and degradation finally faced the same powerlessness he had imposed on others. There was no satisfaction in it, no surge of triumph or joy, only the hollow completion of a task that had become as inevitable as sunrise. She had not acted from hatred but from necessity, not for revenge but for the simple recognition that some evils were too great to be permitted continued existence. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent as if the very atmosphere had been waiting for this moment of resolution. The thunder moved away toward the Gulf of Mexico, leaving behind a silence that felt clean and empty, purged of the oppressive weight that had pressed down on the plantation for decades. Even the old house seemed to sigh with relief, its timbers settling into positions they hadn't occupied since before Blackwood's. Corruption had begun to poison everything within its walls. Blackwood's final breath carried the scent of brandy and moral decay, his body going limp against the mahogany desk that had served as the throne from which he'd dispensed his particular brand of tyranny. The ledgers lay open beside him, their pages now splattered with the blood of their author, the coded entries that had reduced human souls to livestock finally receiving the commentary they deserved. Delphine stood in the sudden stillness, the blade still warm in her hand, feeling empty in a way that went beyond exhaustion. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had become something her younger self would have found unrecognizable. But looking at Blackwood's corpse, at the evidence of his crimes scattered across the desk, she felt no regret, only the terrible clarity that came with completing a task that no one else could have performed. The portraits of dead masters seemed less judgmental now, their painted eyes reflecting not disapproval but something closer to recognition. Perhaps they too had faced moments when the accumulation of their choices demanded payment in the coin of consequence. Perhaps even monsters sometimes understood, in their final moments, exactly what they had become. Outside, the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, painting the storm clouds in shades of blood and redemption. The plantation would never be the same, could never be the same, now that its foundational pillar of terror had been removed. But that was a problem for the future, for the world that would have to decide what justice looked like in the aftermath of necessary violence. For now there was only silence, and the weight of iron finally set down after 20 years of carrying it toward this inevitable destination. Dawn broke over Blackwood Plantation like a judgment rendered in shades of crimson and gold, the storm-washed sky reflecting the blood that had finally balanced 20 years of accumulated debt. Delphine stood at the study window, watching the sun rise over the Brazos River bottomland, the blade still warm in her hand. Behind her, Cornelius Blackwood's corpse had already begun to take on the waxy pallor of moral corruption made manifest in death. The ledgers lay open beside him, their pages now bearing the commentary they had always deserved, written not in ink, but in the blood of their author. The silence felt different now, clean and empty in a way she had never experienced during her 2 decades of bondage. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on every living thing within the plantation's borders seemed to have lifted with Blackwood's final breath, leaving behind an atmosphere that actually allowed for the possibility of hope. Even the ancient oaks outside appeared less twisted in the morning light, their branches reaching toward heaven rather than clawing at the earth in permanent despair. But Delphine knew better than to mistake this moment of peace for any kind of salvation. Justice and survival were different creatures entirely, and while she had delivered the former, the latter remained as elusive as ever. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway reminded her that Blackwood's death would demand its own price, paid not in the currency of moral satisfaction, but in the coin of consequences that would echo through whatever remained of her life. The study door opened to admit Josiah, Blackwood's overseer, his weathered face still bearing the marks of sleep suddenly interrupted. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had witnessed violence in many forms, his gaze moving from the corpse to the blood-stained blade in Delphine's hand, to the ledgers that lay open like an indictment of everything he had helped to perpetuate. Jesus Christ, he breathed, though whether in prayer or profanity was impossible to determine. What have you done, woman? I've ended it, Delphine replied, her voice carrying the terrible calm that came from standing on the far side of an unbridgeable chasm. 20 years of watching evil flourish while good people convinced themselves that nothing could be done. I did what needed to be done. Josiah's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his hip, but stopped when he met her eyes. What he saw there was not the wild desperation of someone who had acted in passion, but the cold certainty of someone who had calculated every possible outcome and chosen the only path that led toward justice. This was not a woman who could be cowed by threats or reasoned with through appeals to self-preservation. You know what comes next, he said quietly, his voice carrying more resignation than anger. The law won't see this as anything but murder, no matter what he might have done to deserve it. The law, Delphine repeated, and her laugh held no humor. Yes, I know all about the law. The same law that made me property. The same law that gave him license to do whatever he pleased with the bodies and souls under his dominion. Tell me, Josiah, when has the law ever protected anyone who looked like me? Other slaves had begun to gather in the doorway, drawn by voices and the unmistakable scent of spilled blood. Their faces showed a complex mixture of emotions, fear, certainly, but also something that might have been relief, or even a kind of awed recognition. Among them stood Seraphina, her young face bearing the hollow expression that would mark her for years to come, the look of innocence murdered as surely as if it had been stabbed through the heart. Mama? The word came out as barely a whisper, weighted with all the questions that could never be adequately answered. What happens now? Delphine looked at her daughter and saw the future stretching out before them like a road paved with impossible choices. They could run, certainly, disappear into the vast wilderness of East Texas and hope that distance might provide what justice never could. But she had seen enough of the world to know that freedom was not simply a matter of geography, that the chains Blackwood had forged would follow them wherever they went. Now, she said, setting the blade carefully on the desk beside Blackwood's open ledgers, we face the consequences of living in a world where monsters are protected by law and their victims are condemned by the very act of resistance. The sound of hoofbeats on the shell drive announced the arrival of riders, neighbors most likely, drawn by reports of the night storm or simply making their regular social calls to a fellow member of the Virginia Gentlemen's Club that had transplanted itself to the Texas frontier. Soon the news would spread throughout Washington County and beyond. A slave had killed her master, had crossed the ultimate line that separated property from human beings. Delphine walked to the window and watched the horsemen approach, their faces already set in expressions of righteous indignation before they even knew what had transpired. These were Blackwood's peers, men who shared his appetites if not his particular methods, who would see her act not as justice but as the most dangerous kind of precedent. They would demand swift retribution, would invoke law and order and divine mandate to justify whatever horrors they visited upon her in response. "I could say you weren't here," Josiah offered quietly, surprising her with the suggestion. "Could claim it was robbers or—" "No." The word came out sharp as broken glass. "I won't hide behind lies, and I won't let anyone else bear the weight of what I chose to do." She turned from the window to face the assembled slaves, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. 20 years ago, I thought survival was enough. I thought endurance was a form of victory. But survival means nothing if it comes at the cost of watching evil flourish while goodness withers." She moved to the desk and picked up one of the ledgers, its pages falling open to reveal columns of names and prices. Human souls reduced to arithmetic. These books tell the true story of Cornelius Blackwood's life. Not the hymns he sang on Sundays or the scripture he quoted to justify his actions, but the actual ledger of his moral debts, and debts eventually must be paid. The writers had reached the main house now, their voices carrying through the morning air as they called out greetings to a man who would never answer again. Soon they would discover the truth, would see the evidence of what happened when the oppressed finally found the courage to become the oppressor's nightmare. The machinery of legal retribution would begin to turn, inexorable as the sunrise, grinding toward a conclusion that everyone in the room understood with perfect clarity. But in this moment, surrounded by the people who had shared her bondage and witnessed her transformation, Delphine felt something that might have been peace. Not happiness, she was too wise to mistake necessity for joy, but the deep satisfaction that came from finally acting in accordance with one's true nature rather than the role imposed by circumstance. "I want you all to remember something," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had crossed into territory that few would ever dare to explore. "Evil doesn't end itself. It requires intervention, requires someone willing to pay the price that justice demands. Today that someone was me. Tomorrow it might be one of you. And when that day comes, I hope you'll remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear because the alternative is watching monsters devour everything decent in the world." The sound of boots on the front steps announced that their time was running short. Soon the outside world would intrude with its laws and its judgments, its careful systems designed to ensure that property remained property and masters remained masters. But for now, in this blood-stained study where the ledgers of human suffering finally lay open to the light, truth held dominion. Delphine walked to the hiding place where she had concealed the blade for so many weeks, carefully sliding the loose floorboard back into place. Let them search for the weapon. Let them tear apart every inch of the slave quarters looking for evidence. The blade itself was no longer important. What mattered was the precedent it had established. The proof that even the most carefully constructed system of oppression contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The front door opened with a crash, and voices filled the hallway, white voices, demanding explanations and threatening consequences. Delphine straightened her shoulders and walked toward the doorway, leaving behind the corpse of the man who had defined her existence for 20 years. She moved with the dignity of someone who had finally claimed ownership of her own story, who had written its conclusion in terms that no law or custom could erase. Behind her, the ledgers lay open in the morning sunlight, their pages fluttering in the breeze from the broken window. The accounts were finally balanced, the moral debt paid in full. Whatever came next would be reckoning of a different sort, not justice perhaps, but consequence, which was sometimes the closest thing to justice that a broken world could provide. What price are we willing to pay for justice when the system itself is corrupted? Subscribe and share your thoughts on this final chapter of Resistance, because some stories demand to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable their truths. The conversation continues in your comments below. The weight of iron had been lifted at last, but the weight of choice and its consequences would follow her to whatever end awaited. In a world where good and evil wore the same respectable faces, sometimes the only honest response was to embrace the darkness that others created and turn it back upon them with interest compounded over decades of careful patience. The sun climbed higher over the Brazos River, illuminating a plantation forever changed by one woman's refusal to accept that evil was simply the natural order of things. The corruption had finally met its cure, administered with surgical precision by hands that had been forced to learn the weight of both iron and injustice. In the end, that was all any of them could do: bear witness to the truth that monsters, no matter how well-dressed or legally protected, eventually called forth their own destruction. The only question was whether there would be anyone left with the courage to answer when that call came. Delphine had answered. Now it was the world's turn to decide what that answer meant.